Tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Nina Hood toko ingoa. Good evening, my name's Nina Hood and I'm the founder of the Education Hub, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this evening. Before I introduce you to our panelists tonight, I'm going to provide a brief overview of our report, The Illusion of Inclusion. The Education Hub has been interested in neurodiversity and the experiences of neurodivergent children and students for over 5 years. We've also heard from people engaging with the Education Hub, teachers and leaders from across early childhood and the school sector, that they are ill-equipped to support the needs of their neurodivergent students. I also have a very personal investment in this report as the mother of a school-aged neurodivergent child. The purpose of the report is threefold. Firstly, it seeks to draw further attention to the challenges and opportunities facing neurodivergent young people and their whānau, and in particular, the depth of the systemic issues and the long-term damage these are so often causing. Secondly, it gives voice to the people who are grappling with a broken system, capturing the experiences of 2,400 parents, teachers, leaders, neurodivergent young people, and those working in support services. And finally, the report identifies what needs to happen both in the short term and in the long term to ensure that neurodivergent young people are provided with the environments, opportunities, and supports that they need to thrive throughout their lives. The overarching message in the report is of a broken system, a system where there is not enough resource, where there are significant issues with accessing funding and the availability of funded services, high thresholds for receiving support, which means that many children who are deserving support do not receive it, complicated bureaucracy, long wait lists, and a lack of specialist personnel. We heard from teachers and leaders who are often overwhelmed. While many teachers and schools are doing remarkable work, this is not happening across the board. There is not enough funding or support for schools, too few teacher aides, limited professional learning opportunities, and in many instances, poor or restrictive policies, exclusionary practices, and limiting beliefs. There is overarching agreement that the current system is not only not fit for purpose, but in many cases is doing active long-term harm to neurodivergent young people. For many respondents, while there are immediate changes that would improve the current situation, what they really want and need is a complete overhaul of our education system. We called the report Illusion of Inclusion because we believe that that is what is happening in New Zealand's education system. While neurodivergent children and those with special educational needs have access to education, they currently do not have access or the legal right to the support services or resources that they need to fully participate in and benefit from education, and this needs to change. Before I introduce our guests and we get on to the webinar proper, just a few points for this evening. Firstly, we wanted to provide some definitions of key terms. Firstly, neurodiversity is a biological fact. It is a word for the infinite variation in the neurocognitive functioning within the human species. Put simply, it means that all humans are wired differently. An individual is neurodivergent if their mind functions differently from the dominant societal standards of normal. An individual is neurotypical if their mind conforms to what is constructed as normal in their society. Examples of neurodivergent conditions include autism, ADHD, developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, auditory and visual processing disorder, FASD, among others. Just to note that we are recording the webinar this evening, so if you have friends or colleagues who aren't able to join us, the recording will go up on our onto our website sometime tomorrow. And finally, as most of you have definitely noticed, given the number of messages currently coming through on the chat, we have enabled the chat function. And if we have time towards the end of the webinar, we will ask questions from the audience to our panel members. Just a reminder that we realise that this topic does raise many emotions for a lot of people, and we ask that you remain respectful throughout, and that you realise that our guests this evening are speaking from their own personal experiences and the experiences with those people that they interact with, and we hope that you remain respectful towards them. It's now my pleasure to introduce our three guests, who I'm sure if you've been following the media attention today, you will have heard a lot from as well, which is fantastic, and it's great to be able to have them here this evening. First of all, we have Tami Harris, who is a registered psychotherapist and the CEO of Acorn Neurodiversity, a charity in Tamaki Makaurau, giving neurodivergent children and youth the tools they need to reach their potential. Acorn is building a future in which all neurodivergent people can fully participate, belong, and thrive. Kia ora, Tami. It's wonderful to have you here this evening.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Dr. Willow Sainsbury, who is a registered educational psychologist who has worked at the Ministry of Education and in the RTLB service. She completed her PhD on co-occurrence with a focus on AUDHD children. She's a lecturer at the University of Auckland, where she is creating a new training pathway for educational psychologists. Kia ora, Willow.
Kia ora.
And finally, but certainly not least, we have Annabelle March, and she's an education and history student at Te Harawaka Victoria University of Wellington. She's also a neurodiversity champion for the Neurodiversity in Education Coalition. Kia ora tātou, it's wonderful to have you all with us, and thank you so much for coming along this evening to share some of your experiences and insights. We're going to roughly break the webinar into two parts. First, we're going to look at what's wrong, and secondly, we're going to look at what it is that we need to change in the system in order to better support our neurodivergent young people. Willow, I'm going to come to you first. From your perspective, what do you see as the primary challenges facing the system?
Kia ora tātou. Thanks, Nina. Shout out to the Education Hub. Well done for just such an amazing report, Nina, and everything that you've and your team have achieved. We really needed this report, I think. As the report was pointed out, and many of the parents and educators who are here today already know, there are just like so many issues. But I'm going to start with diagnosis because it's an area I've been involved with for a while. And there's two kind of key issues that I'm going to address. The first is, should we diagnose, and then access to diagnosis. So in answer to the first question, ideal world, pie in the sky thinking, we'd be able to offer such amazing needs-based support to all our neurodiverse learners that a diagnosis perhaps becomes unnecessary. You know, when you talk to parents about diagnosis, the answer of why a diagnosis, it's because usually support for their child. So it's worth keeping this position in mind when contemplating the issues in the system. But I do think a neurodivergent identity is powerful, not only for the child, but for the parents and those around the child. It's an understanding, a sense of forgiveness for everyone's something really positive. So taken from this position that we currently have a system that requires diagnosis, that offers little support, and that diagnosis can promote understanding, I'm going to move to my next issue, which is access. So this is probably the point that I feel I need to go pour myself a big glass of wine because I do find access to diagnosis pretty depressing at the moment. We have a highly opaque medical deficit-focused system that requires a pathway from a GP through to sometimes an 18-month waiting list. And then parents can see a multitude of different practitioners. This pathway isn't clear to parents and to many families. And those who can often feel they're forced to go privately. It sometimes feels like parents are in a constant battle with this system. There's a lot of arbitrary thresholds, which you already mentioned in your introduction, with parents being told their child's sort of too mild or made eye contact or some such dismissive call, or there are gatekeepers to diagnosis, such as parenting courses or deflection from health to mental health or education. I would also venture to say that you have to be rich in Aotearoa to have a diagnosis of dyslexia, and I'd really like to see that change. It's really hard, if not impossible, in the public system. We just have so many inequities, and once parents are often broken from the diagnosis process, we make them start again to fight for support for services, which often involves layers of professionals repeating sometimes a similar process, and yet they're all underfunded to provide tangible support. And we're often only able to give it for a really small term. In my study, so many parents took the time to express gratitude for the resources that they did have and acknowledge how hard it must be for other families, and also recognize how much pressure teachers and others in learning support are under. So I could go on with multiple glasses of wine, but I'm going to leave it there for those two issues: access to diagnosis and diagnosis itself. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Willow, and thank you for sharing those experiences. And so many of the ideas you've raised are things that got raised by the respondents in the study as well, around the issues with actually getting diagnosed. I'm going to be terrible, and I'm going to break the order that we decided that we were going to follow earlier on, because Annabelle, last week we had a really interesting conversation prior to this webinar around that issue of whether we should diagnose, which Willow has brought up. And I just wondered whether you could share some of your thoughts on experiences on that question.
Yeah, definitely. So, kia ora, I'm Annabelle. So I kind of my story is that I was identified as gifted in probably like year 1, 2, 3, or 4, that kind of scope. And then it wasn't until I was in my last year of high school, year 13, and in September of about that year, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and then subsequently the year after autism. And so for me, the whole concept of diagnosis has been a huge thing. And when we talk about labels, and when we talk about diagnoses, or should we diagnose or should we not diagnose, I think here's how I often, okay, let me be concise. Here's how I often relate it back to physical illnesses. If you broke a leg, would you go, I'm not sure if I want to diagnose this person with a broken leg, because what about the stigma that comes with a broken leg? No, they've got a broken leg, so you go, this person has a broken leg. So what's the difference with, say, I don't want to diagnose this person with ADHD because of the stigma attached to it? They have ADHD. Like, in the grand scheme of things, where is the difference between that and a physical illness? That's the big thing that sort of gets me. It's not a bad thing. It comes back to that whole stigma thing. The reason that we don't want to diagnose our kids is because of the whole labels are bad. Labels are, labels will set your kid up for failure, stuff like that. But you wouldn't do the same for a child that has a physical illness. And I think, I'll be concise and stop there. But that's kind of the main thing for me. Getting my diagnosis saved my life, changed my life. I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't get that diagnosis. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that was.
Thank you, Annabelle, for sharing. And I think I can speak for me from the perspective of a parent. Receiving diagnoses for my son has been personally, and I realize that it's up to everyone to decide whether it's useful for them, but for me personally, it's been incredibly valuable, because it's given me a lens for understanding some of what he's going through, for thinking about, what it is we need to be doing in order to best support him, and also provided me with something of a language to be able to talk about it with others as well. So for me personally, I've found it valuable as well, although recognize that it's a case-by-case basis. Tami, I want to come to you now, because in your line of work, you engage with a huge number of children and young people and their whānau. So Willow's spoken about the challenges around even getting a diagnosis in New Zealand. For you, what do you see as some of the greatest challenges facing our system?
Well, I think it's perfect, kind of carrying on from what Annabelle said, that one of the things that we see and think a lot is that, just like Annabelle was saying, you get a diagnosis, And it means something, it guides something, right? You know, you have a better idea of what's needed, of what it will be like. You might have a community thanks to the diagnosis. And I think thinking about it in a, physical disability, a physical illness sort of way, it can be appropriate, because I often say, if you went and you got a diagnosis of diabetes, and then they, sent you on your way, bye, good luck, enjoy your diabetes. That's kind of how it is right now with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, is you can go all through that waiting list of the, months and months to get your diagnosis. And then poor parents, we expect that you'll get it. And then they'll say, okay, so now here, try this and do this and call this person and join this group. But that's not actually what happens. It's pretty much like you've got diabetes, sorry, there's no insulin, is sort of the way it is with autism. You get your diagnosis and you're kind of sent on your way with the grief, the processing, the, thinking about the future that comes with that, but without any of the support network. And so I think what our families and myself personally on this journey would really like a clear pathway, so that when people are finally able to access that diagnosis, then there's a clear step. Okay, so now this is what you can do to help your child learn to communicate. This is what you can do to help your child learn self-help skills. This is how they might learn more emotional regulation, because there's clear international evidence base around all of those things. I think every sort of form of neurodivergence has a very large international research base around best practice. But for some reason in New Zealand, those best practices are not available. Like you have mentioned, Willow, those are available to people who have money, but not always. And sometimes even people who have the financial resources aren't able to access them. Depends where you live. It's sort of a geographical lottery. It depends on wait lists. In Auckland, there's huge wait lists for private providers and for public providers. And so those supports aren't available. And if you do access a private, say, speech therapist or a private psychologist, they're not integrated and they're not talking to each other. And so I think, we need a clear pathway where parents are given supports that are integrated, that work together rather than against each other, so that families have a real support team and have a sense of kind of a continuum of supports through their child's development. So it's not this sort of siloed, you might get this from the Ministry of Ed and you might get this from health. There's nothing joined up in the process currently, and families just don't know how to navigate it. And some families, we work with lots of family who English isn't their first language. And I mean, navigating the system, even when you are a professional in the system, I find very difficult, let alone being somebody without the time, financial resources, or, language abilities, is really, really difficult. So I think our families would really like to see more resources publicly funded and available, as they are in almost every other country. In fact, in our parent advocacy group meeting today, there were a couple of women whose families are from India, and they were talking about, even in India, their child has support every single day. They get a diagnosis and there's a whole plan put into place. And so I think we can look to so many other countries to guide us in terms of what could be helpful here in New Zealand. We'd love to see that.
Thanks, Tami. And just picking up on that final point, one of the things that we did when we were doing the initial research for the report was we did an analysis between what the funding system in New Zealand versus the funding system in Australia and in the US. And what became very apparent from doing that analysis, and it's a very small analysis, but was just how limited the funding is in the New Zealand system. Yeah.
And another thing about that, just in terms of the education system, I think that one of the biggest challenges for families is that there's only two forms of funding, really. There's ORS funding, ongoing resource scheme, that a child might get if they have very high needs, and then they would have that kind of for life. And then there's nothing else. So there is no other funding that follows a child through their education. So every family, every school, every teacher is scrapping around trying to find little chop and change resources and supports, which just does not lead to any kind of, pathway of development to potential.
Absolutely. And I've had a number of families and schools contact me around the ORS funding to say, yes, some students do qualify for OARS, but even those students, in many cases, the support they receive is not nearly enough support for what they actually need. So we've got two gaps essentially between the students that get some funding and the students that get very little. And then even those students that do get that funding, it doesn't go far enough.
Exactly.
Annabelle, I want to turn to you now to hear about some of your experiences and where you think the system's currently at in terms of the support available or not for neurodivergent students.
Yeah, definitely. So I have I'm going to say I have a unique experience, and I have one that is not the norm, which is unacceptable. Just prefacing that. But I went to a wonderful school, and I was there from probably about year 4 to year 13, so right the way through. And although I didn't have a diagnosis of ADHD until year 13, my school was still able to wanted to help and provide the support for what I needed. But again, that's in the restraints of what they can actually do within the system. When teachers are looking for resources, and when I was sitting with my teachers trying to, work together on what could work, there was just nothing readily available that we could just pick on. It took my teachers, being exceptional human beings, to actually go out of their way in their own time, and in their own, literally out of their own time and goodwill to go and actively search for things to help me. And that's one person. And I think about that in the fact that I was very privileged with the school I attended. And it's a harrowing thought that even the fact that I attended, I was very privileged in the school I attended, and yet I still faced challenges by the overarching system. The experience for the majority of New Zealanders is just abominable. And I want to be really clear that I loved my teachers, and I don't think that I have huge respect for our teachers. That's why I'm studying to be a primary school teacher. And what I've found throughout, the years of going through the education system, and also now talking to teachers and working with them, and hearing their, stories, is that they want to help. They want to, the whole purpose of, I guess, being a teacher is to do the best by your students. They want to help, but they can't help to the extent that is needed when they don't have the resources, the funding, the information needed. And so it's all very well to say things like, teachers need to identify this, that, and the other, but where is the PD? Where is the funding? There's nothing of that. And what we're expecting is for our teachers to do that in their own time and go out of their own way. And that, in my opinion, is unacceptable, because my teachers were the ones that actually, even without a diagnosis, my teachers were the ones that helped me kind of stay afloat. I wouldn't be here without them. And they were the one, in year 13, my whole kind of story with getting an ADHD diagnosis was in year 13. I was kind of given a mentor for a teacher who was a mentor to me, and she was new to the school, and we'd never met before. And so we were talking, and she raised the possibility of ADHD. And I remember saying something along the lines of, well, but I can't have ADHD because I was told I was gifted in year 3 or whatever, and I didn't think you could have both. And she was like, oh, okay. And then we sort of went down that line, and she is kind of, her and the school are the reason that I have that diagnosis. And so for me, even though my school experience was very privileged in the sense that the actual school I went to was wonderful, you can still see the challenges that the overarching system has for everyone, not just the students, the teachers, the leadership, everybody. It's hard to, I'll be concise and I'll stop. But I think that's kind of my experience, I think.
And Annabelle, you've had a huge amount of support from people in the chat for what you've just said. And I think, your message, particularly for teachers and school leaders, is something that came through very strongly in our data as well, of the vast majority of teachers wanting to support their students, wanting to do their best by their students, but recognizing that, you know, in the majority of cases, they don't have the knowledge base. They haven't been supported to enable them to do that. And the realities of the numbers, where if you have a class of 30 students, it is quite likely that 5 or 6 students within that class are neurodivergent, all with different conditions or different combinations of conditions, generally with very little resourcing available. And being able to support all 30 of those children with what it is that they need is nigh on impossible. And I think one of the things that came out really strongly in our data was the level of burnout among teachers, and just some really heartbreaking stories of teachers essentially saying that they'd got to the end of the road, that they couldn't do it anymore because of the struggle involved, because they didn't feel like they could continue to support all their students at the level that they wanted to be able to do. And so I think, you know, what you've just spoken about is incredibly powerful and definitely reflective of so many people. Well, I wonder if we could come back to you on that point, because you are a trained teacher. You have worked as an RTLB, you've worked as a Ministry of Ed educational psychologist. So you've had a lot of engagement with schools and with teachers. And I just wonder what your experiences are like in engaging with teachers in schools.
Well, I just want to echo again what you've just said. I mean, everybody is under-resourced and under-supported and actually really exhausted. Burnout is, and trying their best. Everyone also went into the roles because they wanted to support neurodiverse learners. Yeah, so certainly my experience across the board is that we're not properly resourced. Everybody is trying really hard, often to upskill as quick as possible. That you can just be spread really thin. RTLBs, educational psychologists, where, and I would venture other professionals as well, the teacher aid support, we fight for it every term as well. I would love to be in a position to see long-term teacher aid support and support for teacher aides. So yeah, certainly my experience echoes what you and found, Nina, and what you've been articulating in the report. Yeah, for sure.
And I think, you know, whilst there was a huge number of teachers in schools that were trying to do their best by their students, I think one of the things that was really heartbreaking to read that came through in the testimonials of both teachers and students actually was that whilst there are teachers in schools that are doing their best and trying to learn more and to upskill, there are also some that are really not. That there's still a lot of misinformation out there, that there are still a number of teachers who don't actually believe in neurodivergence, don't believe that different conditions exist. And also a number of school policies which are in many cases actively harming neurodivergent children, that are overly restrictive, that don't give neurodivergent students access to the different supports that they need and are entitled to, that put barriers in place that don't need to be there. And Tami, I just wonder if we could come to you to see whether in your work that's something that you've experienced with the young people in whānau that you've engaged with.
Yeah, definitely. We see a lot of the expectation that if you're in a mainstream classroom, you should be just like everybody else. And if you're not, then it's generally the problem of the kid or the parent often being called in to solve the problem. And so I think there's not a recognition that every child can learn, but some children need extra different ways of teaching, different ways of learning, and those aren't accessible to every child in a mainstream classroom. No matter how wonderful the teacher is, a child who has, limited communication skills is not just going to pick that up by being in the back of a classroom. They need actual specialist support to learn those skills, and then hopefully, they would be able to join in the discussion in the classroom. But I think we do a lot of just sort of putting kids in and assuming, same for everyone, that's fair. And there's not the resources for the actual bit that will help them learn in the way that they need to learn. So we have a lot of young people, unfortunately, who aren't allowed to attend school full time, who are on 2 or 3 hours a day of schooling because that's the only time that there's a teacher aide available. And then they have to go home, which means a parent isn't able to work. And the child's not actually learning, which is clearly a human rights issue. But we see that happening all over. And also this sort of attitude of it being kind of optional to take kids who have learning disabilities from schools that say, oh, we're not resourced to, teach your child. I don't think we can do it. I recommend you do homeschooling or you find a different school. So there doesn't seem to be this compunction that, wait, you live in the community, you get to come to our school, we'll take care of you. There's often a sort of passing on to, somebody else might be able to resolve this better. Which is not helpful to our young people.
Nina, I want to jump in there because I actually see the two issues connected sometimes. If that professionals and teachers aren't given the knowledge to support neurodiverse learners, then sometimes, not for everyone, but sometimes it can be a protection mechanism to say, okay, this doesn't because you don't have the support. So yeah, I'm just conscious of the fact that the two are connected. If we don't upskill and support people, then sometimes they adopt a position it's even more unhelpful for supporting neurodiverse learners.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that so much needs to come, I think, from leadership and setting the sort of culture of a school to be neurodiversity affirming and accepting that different people learn in different ways, and we'll do our best to figure that out, because the reality is parent doesn't necessarily know that. Nobody can be expected to know the needs of every child and know how to meet those. You have to sort of learn as you go, but having the resources and kind of the culture of, we don't know yet, but we'll figure it out and we're going to work with you, would be incredible. Willow, I remember talking with you before this about, like, wouldn't it be great if schools and teachers were like, yay, I've got this really cool, quirky kid coming into my class. I'm going to, try and understand how they work and tick. And I mean, that would be amazing.
That's dream for the future, right? That teachers and schools are supported and set up to be just really excited to have the neurodiverse children in their classroom, that they're just like, I can't wait. Oh my gosh, they've got autism and ADHD and dyslexia and sensory processing difficulties. And that's so cool. And yeah, shout out to lots and lots of people who have co-occurring conditions, which sometimes can feel like things can get even more complicated. So that's a dream, isn't it? That schools and teachers are so excited to have neurodiverse kids in their classrums.
I just want to quickly jump in as well. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, go for it, Annabelle.
I just want to vouch for the whole. I so agree with the whole leadership thing, and firsthand seeing it in my school, just how much of a difference it makes when it's coming from the top down. It can't be understood. It can't be understated how important that is, because that creates the culture for the entire school. And when you have posters, just even recognizing neurodivergent students and things like that, it doesn't seem like much, but small things that we do in these schools, in our schools, they make such a big difference. But yeah, just vouching for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can speak from personal experience, having, I was talking to the leader of my son's early childhood centre when he was still in early childhood, and he was talking about how they approach having neurodivergent children in the centre. And, he'll talk about, they'll have a conversation with the parents and the parents will bring things up. And whenever he's talking to the parents in that first instance, his response is always, absolutely, we can definitely deal with that. We've got this. You just tell us what you're going to need and we'll make it happen. And then he told me that, he'd go away after and think, oh my God, how are we going to deal with that? But they always did. and it was a team effort, and it was led from the top, and it was a beautifully inclusive, strengths-based culture, for which I am eternally grateful that my son got to experience that, and similarly is in a school that is incredibly inclusive now. Annabelle, I just want to come quickly to you, because you made a really interesting comment last week about some of the differences you experienced when you entered the university system, vis-a-vis what you experienced in the school system. And I just wonder, as we sort of start to think about, well, what is it that we could do to change things that are happening in our school system? Could you just talk a little bit about some of those experiences?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I think one of the major things I've realized is that talking with the kind of with the disability advisors here at well, that's one thing. There's disability and inclusion advisors at the university, and the main thing is that they are required to have an action plan, like a disability action plan, an inclusive action plan. And I had no idea that that was even a thing. And we can see that works, because the amount of the ease of trying to get support or being able to access support when entering tertiary level is so substantially different from the secondary primary sector. And I think that comes down to the fact, well, one of the things is that they are required to have an action plan for how they're going to, include and amplify disabled people at university. So when I look at that, I'm like, well, why that's working here? Why can't we, or how can we implement this in the secondary and primary sector? Because I think it's just so much more, that just resources are just so much more easily available. You're like, when I enrolled in university, it was like, do you have sort of blah, blah, ADHD, blah, 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 blah. And then just like that, disability advisor sat me down, got a plan, snapped my fingers. And so I think, the difference between the tertiary sector and then primary and secondary is substantial. And I think that, one of the main things is that compulsory learning action plan, which is one of my key, let's implement that in the primary and secondary sector.
Can I follow on from that? Because there is, IEPs, individual educational plans, are a thing that exist, but we don't see them used systematically. And there isn't like you're describing, an actual almost legal framework where they are compelled to do it at the tertiary level. And many countries have that as well, where there is a legal obligation to the IEP, that it's a plan that's put into place, a support plan with certain objectives for the child's learning. Those need to be met, or there's actual legal recourse. A parent can come in and say, wait a minute, my child's not learning this the way we had talked about. Can we do something else? Or what's the next goal? So that it's always being acted upon, and there's always progress towards particular goals, which reflects sort of a growth mindset that every child can learn. They're not just, tucked over here in this classroom where they're just, hanging out, but that every single child has goals and objectives that they're going to be learning. And then that creates a culture of expectation that every child is going to be learning, every child is capable, and then some accountability in the system. So I absolutely agree, Annabelle, that would be an amazing start to making the system overall more, sort of growth mindset and more accountable.
Yeah, I just shout out to my educational psychology colleagues. We do IEPs, but again, just not enough for the resource. And also there is a lot of things in between a kind of specific IEP. I'm thinking of some more collaborative Te Ao Māori approaches, so Tipikini Ki Runga, Meihana models, some really great models that also lend towards those really collaborative goal setting, making sure that everyone's on board. But wouldn't it be great if we were all working towards a plan like that there had to be something in place? Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's something that we identify in the report as being a change that we'd like to see in the New Zealand education, is actually a change to the Education Act that not only gives neurodivergent children the right to attend a state school, but also mandates that they must receive the resourcing and supports that they need in order to be able to learn and thrive at school. And it was something that I thought about last year, because I was like, right, who can I sue about the fact that there's nothing in place? And I got told, well, you can't do that in New Zealand. There's actually no legal obligation for the education system to be providing for these children. And, you know, obviously that's absolutely outrageous. But we do need something that actually means that the education system as a whole is held accountable for making sure that these young people actually receive the support and resourcing that they need to get an education. I want to turn now to, we've sort of started to touch on it, around what it is that we'd like to see change. So Willow, if I could come to you first, from your perspective, what is it that you'd really like to see happen in the system?
We have to have access to diagnosis for all in a timely manner. Like you know, before you can get support, you need a diagnosis in our system. So it has to be in a timely manner. And this is wild, but what about a category of support for those that are waiting for diagnosis? I'd like to see the Ministry of Education allow educational psychologists to be a diagnostic service, at least for dyslexia and other learning difficulties, currently not. I'd like a coordinated platform for neurodevelopmental conditions to be recognised by multidisciplinary teams that feeds direct into support services. So there has been some attempts to do this. I know shout out to the autism coordinators who have done some of this work for autism diagnosis. So diagnosis, timely manner, coordinated platform right through from diagnosis to supports. And I think just what we were bringing up before, that teachers and schools excited for neurodiverse learners to walk through their doorways.
Absolutely. And Willow, picking up on that idea of making diagnosis actually available to all children, what are some of the specifics that it would take? Because, you know, we hear at the moment about incredibly long wait lists. You know, you brought up the point about educational psychologists through the Ministry of Education actually need to be able to diagnose, but presumably we also just need more specialists working across the education and health systems as well in order to cut down those 24-month wait times for children and their whānau to actually see someone who might be able to start that diagnosis process.
Yeah, absolutely. More professionals. And this system is all interconnected, as we know. As Annabelle said, if you have resources around the school where everybody's on board, then that also reassures families that they might start this process. So, you know, everybody's involved, from professionals very early on, teachers, ECE providers, Plunket nurses. I know there's some great work going on with screeners and Plunket nurses right through. And if we also have a neurodiversity affirming attitude, this doesn't have to be something that's negative and deficit in medical. It can be something positive, supporting people on their journey. But it is all I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, we need more professionals. We also need more support. We also need a change in attitude. It's like a whole systems overhaul that looks different. So yeah, I'll add that one to the list.
And Tami, how about for you? What is it that you'd really like to see change?
Well, I think piggybacking on what Willow said, I think that kind of integrated support model, almost like a wraparound model from diagnosis through to getting the actual supports that are needed, more specialist support available in the public system. I think at this point, you know, when a family gets their diagnosis, they start doing their research and they realize that they need speech therapy and they'd like occupational therapy and so on and so forth. And they look around and gosh, there's no funding for those things. And they call the local child development services or their local DHB and they say, nah, you don't meet the criteria, or you get to come in for one time and that's it. So I think in understanding that in order for kids to learn, they often need those specialized supports. And so I think those should be publicly available to those who need it. Again, it comes back to, there are shortages, there's lack of funding, blah, blah, blah. But I think if we're dreaming here, an integrated system, kind of like the Acorn model, which is basically everything under one roof, everything coordinated and integrated together, and then supporting the whānau, supporting the school, so that really every system that the child's involved with is being educated and brought in as part of a, collective plan around that child. Would also really like to see, again, like we sort of talked about, that legal recourse and having some more accountability for families so that they can push and there's actually something tangible to get for their child. Because parents know their children have incredible capability and potential, and they're pretty smart about what their child needs to achieve that. And so I think having some accountability of the system to meet those things would be really great. And also, if we, while I'm on the wish list, if we could somehow bring together education, health, disability, MSD, so that families only have to navigate one ministry, that would be unbelievably life-changing for our families, because to figure out what they get from health, what they get from education, what they get from disability, and then these weird silos where they don't talk to each other, and you've got this from disability, but you can't use that for education, no, or you've got this, but you can't use that. That's not how people work. We aren't made in these little, bits of us. And so I think a joined up approach with a clear focus that's easy to navigate for families.
Yeah, there's an irony there, right? That there's some great work going on in each little, like there is so much great work going on in each little part sometimes, but that it's just not joined up.
Yeah, and people don't know how to access it. Like there's just no clear way to find out what is out there.
Absolutely. And I know that from the responses that took part of the people who took part in our study, and both the parents and teachers, that would be incredibly valuable. So we had a huge amount of feedback from parents saying, we might have been lucky enough to get a diagnosis or several diagnoses. And then we had to figure out what it is we needed to do. And we needed to figure out who we needed to contact. And then we needed to figure out exactly what that support was. And then we realized that we had to do, 10 different applications in order to be able to access that support. And I feel it myself. I am educated. I am involved in education. I'm involved in, I work with people who are involved in a range of different organizations supporting neurodivergent students. I'm really lucky that if I have a problem, I just pick up the phone or I send an email to someone and say, what do I do? But I find it hard to navigate the system. So I genuinely cannot imagine what it must be like for most other families. But we also had that same feedback from teachers who would say, and it's often teachers working in isolation because they care so much with very little support, actually leading some of those application processes for their students. But, they'd say, I'm having to do multiple different applications and I apply for one thing and it gets rejected, so I apply for another thing. And there is no interconnection. And that's incredibly frustrating for just so many people across the system.
Yeah, and it leads to inequity, huge inequity for some people.
Yeah,
absolutely. And that was definitely something that came out very strongly in our report, were the inequities that exist across the system.
Mm-hmm.
Annabelle, I want to come to you now. From your perspective, what is it that you'd really like to see change?
Well, kind of piggybacking off everyone here, I guess, first of all, the thing I focus on a lot is low-hanging fruit for teachers. So often, like coming from often when we talk about this and we tell teachers, there needs to be a huge overhaul, all that, it's often, I find, quite overwhelming in the sense that, okay, we get that something needs to change, but then what do we actually do? And even just little tiny low-hanging fruit that you could go in and just implement in 30 seconds, because we know that a huge overhaul needs to happen, but that it's not going to happen overnight. So what do we do in the interim? Well, we know that there's a problem, so giving our teachers and giving our support people low-hanging fruit that they can just implement easily. And I think that's a huge thing for me. And I think that's, yeah, the other thing that I am really passionate about is also incorporating the Te Ao Māori has the Western approach to, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's that whole deficit thing, autism spectrum disorder. And with Te Ao Māori, like the word for autism is taki watanga, which means in his/her/their own space and time. And the perspective is just so much more strengths-based, or, not deficit-based. And I think that's also something we need to look towards. We have, especially in our, like Aotearoa, we have Te Ao Māori, that we need to move away from this whole deficit-based approach, because I think that's what stops people from, one, wanting to get a diagnosis, or two, actually accepting that, neurodiversity is a thing, and that whole stigma thing. And yeah, well, I mean, I think those are my two big things. The low-hanging fruit, I think, is really important, just because we need a whole system change, but we need people up there to do that. And so what can we do to support our learners in the meantime, I suppose? I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure those are my two main points.
And Annabelle, this is slightly putting you on the spot, but could you give an example or several examples of what some of those low-hanging fruit might be?
Yes, I can. Okay, so I'll start with, I've got two examples here. One is coming from my little primary school based head, and that is picture books. And they can also be used in secondary school, but I have a ton of picture books myself that just sort of, from a very young age, if you have picture books in a classroom, I can provide like lists of all different ones that are great. That just, if you have picture books that they don't necessarily explicitly go, Annabelle has autism, but they just sort of, from a very young age, recognize the diversity among people in the classroom. And getting that from a very young age is so crucial. And I think that picture books are a huge asset to that, and they can also be used in secondary school. So picture books are one thing, kind of self-explanatory, but also the other thing I kind of bring up a lot, is really niche, but it's something that some teacher did for me in year 7 that I haven't forgotten, because I was like, this is genius. And it was before the start of the term, they had sent an anonymous sort of a Google form out, and it was like, what's your ideal learning environment? And there were kind of options. Do you prefer loud, quiet, blah, 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 blah. And there were a lot of options, and it wasn't just like a blank space, tell me what you want, because oftentimes if someone says to me, tell me what you want, I don't know what I want, but I can see from a list, I can go, okay, I prefer a quieter learning environment over that. And so, if you compile a list of responses, and you can see kind of the child doesn't feel put on the spot, because they're not having to directly say to the teacher, I prefer this over this, but it's through a Google form. And I know that doesn't work for everyone, but for me, and I think for a lot of people, for a lot of classes, that's just a really simple, there's a template, blah, 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 send it out. And that's just one easy little thing that can make a huge difference in just knowing or getting a better understanding of how your students in your particular classroom at that particular time work. So are those two good?
Those two are great. They're really great. And I think, the point you make about picture books and the role that a school can play in promoting the idea of inclusivity and promoting the idea that everyone is different, and how we engage with that and what that means on a day-to-day basis is a really powerful thing. And imagine the flow-on effects to the whole of society if we had every school in New Zealand that didn't just say, yes, we, we're zero bullying, we embrace difference, but actually lived that every single day and instilled that amongst all their staff and all their students. That would be a hugely powerful thing that we could take forward as a nation. So fabulous examples. I see that we're very quickly coming to the end of our time, and I want to give all three of our speakers just a chance to leave us with some final reflections and final thoughts this evening. I know that there's much that we haven't had a chance to cover, and much that could be said, but I think it would be wonderful to hear from you, not least because a couple of weeks ago, the government released their 6 priorities for education. And I note that in at number 6 was something on learning support. And the Minister has said on several occasions that she recognises that there are issues with current learning support and that schools are regularly telling her that they need more support for neurodivergent students. So I guess if we end with, what is your key message for the Minister of Education? What would you really like her to understand and know? And what are some of those key changes that you would like to see? You know, the budget is 2 weeks away, so we can but live and dream that there might be some small change in there. Tami, I'm going to come to you first. I know I'm employing cold calling as a tactic, I know, which will horrify some people and I'm sure delight others.
I guess I would have to say just having a continuum of supports in the education system would be very high on my list, that there's not just ors or nothing, or, you know, a 10-week this or that, that we take sort of a developmental approach and there's a variety of different ongoing supports available that children can move kind of in and out of, because development isn't always a straight line, it's not always just one place. So that there's different options, resource teachers, actually, you know, fully trained, qualified professionals that can help with speech or with particular areas of need that are identified, and different supports in the classroom so that all kinds of different needs are recognized and met for learning.
Willow, I'll come to you next.
Oh, I like that one, Tami. Resource professionals and have more professionals. That doesn't mean creating new roles and more layers. We've got LSCs, SENCOs, LEAs, educational psychologists, RTLBs. We don't need more roles. We need a streamlined system with more professionals that are better funded. Yes, that would be my one of many. I'm really trying to keep it into one, but I can feel the floodgates of like but I'll leave it there.
And my guess, Willow, it wouldn't be a bad thing to maybe streamline some of those roles as well, because one of the things that we see coming out a lot is duplication across different roles as well.
Yeah, and we all have in common a lack of funding on the other side of a really lengthy process. Yeah, so absolutely, for sure. We're all doing great work, but we've all got slightly different ways that we overlap and report, and it's really confusing for parents and teachers and everybody.
And Annabelle, finally to you.
I'm trying to think of something also very concise to say, but I think if we're speaking directly to, you know, Education Minister, I keep coming back to the fact that this is not a political football, and it's not a political piece of, you know, to be tossed between, to be debated on. This is a human right. We're talking about human rights here, and I think when you look at that from that perspective, just do it. Like that's very simple, but this is a human rights issue we're talking about. It's no different from talking about, you know, like it's access to education, and that should be a priority. And I think seeing the amount of people here tonight is testament to just how important this is, and just how much, yeah, I'm trying to keep it concise, but yeah, I just think it's not political. It's not political, it's human rights. That's going to be my one sentence. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. And Willow, Tami, Annabelle, thank you so much for joining us here this evening, for sharing your insights and experiences, your thoughts and hopes for what could be, and the possibilities for how we can better support and serve our neurodivergent young people and their whānau. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you all. I'm sure that we could have doubled the length of this webinar and still had more things to talk about, but thank you for coming and sharing your expertise. It's very much appreciated.
Kia ora. Thank you.
And to everyone who is listening in this evening, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your chat, for your ideas and thoughts. There is no way I could have kept up with it all, but I will go away and read them all at a later date, because I think also, you know, no one can do this alone. This has got to be a collective effort, and we've got to learn from everyone involved, and we've got to join forces here as well. So thank you all for sharing and for coming along and listening in and sharing your perspectives. And just a reminder that this has been recorded, and we will be sharing a copy on our website tomorrow, so you can listen in again and share with colleagues and friends as well. But just one more thanks to our speakers. It's been an absolute privilege to get to hear from you this evening. Ko Marie.